Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story that drifts beneath ancient branches, where every breeze seems to carry a whisper older than kingdoms, and every shadow looks suspiciously like it knows something you don't. If you've ever walked into a forest and immediately felt as though the trees were quietly judging your sense of direction, well, tonight's tale may feel strangely familiar. Fortunately, these woods are much more interested in remembering than judging, which is honestly a healthier hobby than what most medieval nobles managed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell everyone in the comments where you're listening from and what the local hour is. It's always fascinating to imagine this story finding listeners beneath different skies, whether dawn is peeking over distant hills or midnight has already wrapped itself around your home like a heavy wool blanket. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man who had spent nearly half his life walking roads that no map bothered to honor. He was not a knight searching for glory. He was not a merchant counting silver. He certainly wasn't a noble, because nobles generally considered walking farther than the castle garden an outrageous inconvenience. They preferred horses, servants, and complaining in equal measure. Instead, he earned his bread by carrying letters, messages, small parcels, and sometimes stories between villages scattered across valleys and hills. His name mattered little. People remembered him more for arriving exactly when rain began than for anything written in church records. Some joked that storms followed him. Others insisted he simply had terrible luck. He personally believed the clouds were extremely committed to making him miserable. One gray autumn morning, after delivering a sealed message to an isolated monastery, he received unexpected advice from one of the elderly brothers. The monk handed him a loaf of coarse bread wrapped in cloth. "You'll want the eastern road," the old man said. The traveler nodded. "The western road floods?" The monk smiled gently. "No." "Bandits?" "No." "Wolves?" "Not today." The traveler frowned. "Then why avoid it?" The old monk looked toward the distant tree line stretching across the horizon. "Because that road enters the forest that remembered everything." Silence settled between them. The traveler blinked once. "That sounds unnecessarily dramatic." The monk chuckled. "Yes." "Is it haunted?" "No." "Cursed?" "Not exactly." "Dangerous?" The monk considered the question for a surprisingly long time. "It depends on how comfortable you are with your own memories." Now that was an answer. No sensible person wanted before breakfast. The traveler laughed politely, thanked the monk, and began walking toward the eastern road exactly as instructed, for nearly an hour. Then, curiosity, that wonderfully inconvenient companion, caught up with him. He stopped beside an old crossroads where weathered wooden markers leaned at impossible angles. One pointed east, the other west. The western sign was faded almost white. Someone long ago had carved tiny leaves around its edges instead of ordinary decorations. Odd choice, very artistic, questionable for road maintenance. He stared toward the western path, disappearing beneath towering trees whose branches knitted together so tightly that daylight itself seemed to ask permission before entering. Birdsong floated from within. Nothing sinister, no screams, no mysterious glowing eyes, just ordinary woodland sounds, which somehow made everything feel even stranger. He sighed. "I'll only look." Every famous last decision begins with remarkably similar confidence. The road welcomed him with soft earth covered in fallen leaves. The air changed almost immediately. Outside the forest, autumn smelled of damp fields and distant chimney smoke. Inside, it carried moss, bark, mushrooms, cold stone, and something impossible to describe. Not magical, not sweet, simply old. Old enough that time itself seemed slower. The trees rose impossibly high. Massive oaks spread branches like cathedral ceilings. Beeches stood smooth and pale beside dark pines, reaching toward invisible skies. Some trunks were so wide that 4 grown men linking hands might still fail to circle them completely. Tiny ferns covered the ground. Golden leaves drifted lazily through shafts of afternoon light. Somewhere nearby, water trickled over hidden stones. The traveler continued carefully. He noticed something peculiar after only a few minutes. The forest was astonishingly quiet, not silent, peaceful. Every sound seemed deliberate. A squirrel's leap, the flutter of wings, the creaking of ancient branches. Nothing interrupted another sound. Everything existed together, almost like careful conversation. He paused beside a fallen log coated with emerald moss. Tiny mushrooms clustered along its side, like miniature umbrellas prepared for mice attending a royal parade. He smiled. Nature certainly enjoyed decorating things no human would ever notice. Curiously, medieval people often believed certain patches of moss revealed places where forgotten travelers had rested centuries before. Whether true or not, many pilgrims refused to disturb such spots, believing memories lingered longer than footprints. The traveler brushed a hand across the moss. Soft, cool, comforting. Then he froze, for just an instant. He could have sworn someone else had touched that exact place. Not physically, more like an impression. As though countless hands separated by generations had rested there before his own. The sensation vanished immediately. He frowned. You're imagining things. Reasonable explanation. Probably. He continued onward. Hours slipped quietly by. The sun shifted overhead, though it barely penetrated the woven canopy. Occasionally, he discovered strange markers carved into trees. Not names, not warnings, simple symbols, a spiral, an open hand, 3 circles touching one another, a single feather, each worn smooth with age, each nearly swallowed by growing bark. No 2 appeared alike, yet none seemed random. He reached a small clearing where sunlight finally spilled freely across the forest floor. At its center stood an enormous stone, almost entirely embraced by roots. Its surface had been polished naturally by centuries of rain. He sat upon it, broke his loaf of bread, and listened. Nothing happened. No spirits appeared. No mysterious voices called his name. No enchanted deer offered philosophical advice, which, if we're being honest, would have made lunch considerably more complicated. Instead, a breeze wandered gently through the clearing. Leaves rustled overhead. The sound rolled from one tree to another, not like wind, more like whispers, not words, never words. Only countless soft voices blending together until they became something deeper than language. The traveler found himself holding perfectly still. He could not explain why. The whispering continued for only a few heartbeats, then stopped. Complete calm returned. Far above, sunlight danced across ancient branches that had watched centuries pass without ever leaving their place. For the first time since entering the forest, the traveler realized something that made the back of his neck prickle. The woods did not feel empty. They felt attentive, not threatening, not welcoming, simply aware. As though every tree had quietly noticed another traveler stepping beneath its branches. And somewhere, far deeper beneath the endless canopy, where roots tangled through forgotten centuries and stones rested exactly where forgotten hands had placed them, the ancient forest had already begun remembering him. The traveler remained seated on the smooth stone for a long while, though he could not have said exactly why. Nothing remarkable stood before him. No glowing path appeared. No mysterious figure emerged from behind a tree with an inconveniently cryptic prophecy. The clearing simply rested in the afternoon light, peaceful enough that even the breeze seemed reluctant to disturb it. Yet something inside him resisted leaving. Perhaps every forest has moments like that, places where your feet become unexpectedly loyal to the ground beneath them. Or perhaps this forest possessed habits unlike any other. Eventually he stood, dusted crumbs from his cloak, adjusted the leather strap across his shoulder, and chose the narrow trail leading north. At least, he believed it led north. The sun offered little help beneath such a thick canopy. His usual confidence in finding directions slowly dissolved beneath layers of branches. Still, he was no stranger to wandering. He had crossed marshes where every patch of grass looked identical. He had climbed hills wrapped in fog, thick enough to convince a sensible man that the world ended 3 steps ahead. Compared to those journeys, this should have been simple. It wasn't. The path curved gently between enormous beeches whose pale trunks rose like silent pillars. The ground remained soft beneath countless generations of fallen leaves. Here and there, clusters of tiny white flowers pushed through the moss. Despite the season, their petals trembling whenever the faintest wind passed. He paused to admire them. I've never seen autumn flowers quite so stubborn. A nearby raven tilted its head. It looked directly at him. Then, with perfect timing, it let out one loud, deeply judgmental croak before flying away. Fair enough, he muttered. Keep your opinions. Even the birds here seemed remarkably confident. He smiled to himself and continued walking. Not long afterward, he noticed the first oddity. A narrow side path appeared between 2 ancient oaks. He was certain it had not been there moments earlier. He stopped. Perhaps he had simply overlooked it. Forests could play tricks with light. He looked carefully. The little trail curved gently into dense ferns before disappearing entirely. No footprints marked the earth. No broken branches suggested recent travelers. Nothing unusual. He shrugged. No. He continued along the wider road. 20 minutes later, the same little path appeared again. Or at least, it looked exactly the same. The same pair of leaning oaks, the same carpet of ferns, the same oddly twisted route crossing its entrance. He frowned. That's impossible. He turned completely around. Behind him stretched the road he had just walked. Ahead lay the side trail, exactly where it should not have been. He searched for landmarks, a broken stump, a patch of bright mushrooms, anything. Nothing looked familiar. The forest had rearranged certainty into something soft and uncertain. He laughed quietly. I've become lost. Admitting it felt strangely comforting. There are few experiences as humbling as realizing an entire woodland has defeated years of practiced navigation. Somewhere, he imagined, every goose that had ever flown south without asking directions was feeling quite smug. He decided upon a simple solution. Continue forward. Eventually, every forest ended. That was, after all, one of the comforting rules of the natural world. Or so he believed. The hours drifted onward. The trees subtly changed. Great pines now towered overhead, filling the air with the sharp scent of resin. Their needles muffled each footstep until his own movement sounded distant. Even his breathing seemed quieter. He crossed a tiny stream whose water ran so clear that every pebble shimmered beneath the surface. The current barely disturbed floating yellow leaves. He knelt to drink. The water tasted astonishingly cold, as though snow still lingered somewhere beneath the earth, despite autumn's arrival. While kneeling, he noticed something carved into a flat stone beside the stream. A simple circle. Inside it, another smaller circle. Nothing more. The carving appeared ancient. Rain had softened its edges. Moss nearly swallowed half the design. He brushed the surface gently. for one fleeting heartbeat. Images flickered through his thoughts. A young woman laughing beside this very stream, children splashing water, an elderly man filling a wooden bucket, a dog barking excitedly. The moments vanished almost before they formed. He sat back quickly, his pulse quickened. What was that? Only silence answered. The stream continued its endless journey over polished stones. The forest remained perfectly calm. He looked again at the carving. Now it appeared ordinary, weathered, empty. He considered every reasonable explanation: fatigue, hunger, the strange atmosphere. Perhaps the cold water had startled him. That seemed sensible. Much more sensible than believing rocks carried memories. He stood. Yet as he resumed walking, he found himself glancing more carefully at every ancient marker he encountered. There were many, some carved into standing stones, others hidden upon tree trunks. One appeared etched into the exposed root of an oak, so old that its bark resembled folded cloth. None resembled letters, none formed words. They felt older than writing itself. Curiously, historians have discovered that many early woodland cultures throughout medieval Europe marked sacred paths with simple symbols rather than written language. A spiral, circle, or hand could communicate belonging, remembrance, or safe passage, long after spoken dialects had disappeared. The traveler wondered whether those forgotten customs had inspired these markings, or whether these markings had inspired forgotten customs. The thought lingered longer than expected. Toward evening, the forest opened into a broad hillside, scattered with enormous stones. Unlike the dense woodland behind him, sunlight poured freely here. Golden beams stretched across tall grasses, swaying gently between weathered boulders. The place felt unexpectedly cheerful. Several rabbits darted between rocks. Butterflies floated lazily despite the cooling air. A family of deer grazed without appearing alarmed by his presence. One young stag lifted its head. It watched him calmly, not frightened, merely curious. The traveler offered a respectful nod. The stag blinked once before returning to its meal. "I appreciate your confidence." If every encounter with wildlife ended so politely, traveling would require considerably fewer emergency bandages. He crossed the hillside slowly. Halfway through, he noticed something impossible. Footprints, fresh ones, pressed clearly into patches of damp earth between stones. At last, another traveler. He knelt to examine them. One pair, leather boots, adult, walking steadily. No sign of panic. The prince continued toward the opposite tree line. Relieved, he followed. It felt wonderful to see evidence that someone else had recently walked here. Perhaps they knew the way out. Perhaps they lived nearby. Perhaps they would explain why forests insisted on behaving like puzzles. The footprints entered the trees once more. He followed carefully. After several hundred paces, they stopped. Not faded, not scattered. Stopped. The final footprint rested upon bare earth beneath an enormous oak. Beyond it, nothing. No leaves disturbed, no broken branches, no further impressions. It was as though the unknown traveler had calmly taken one final step and simply ceased existing. The traveler searched every direction. He circled the oak, inspected the ground, even looked upward into the branches, though he wasn't entirely sure what answer he expected to find there. Nothing, only the great oak. Its bark twisted into deep ridges. Its roots disappeared beneath emerald moss. High overhead, hundreds of leaves shimmered softly in the evening breeze. Then something caught his eye. Embedded within the trunk was an old iron nail. Rust had nearly consumed it. Around the nail, the bark had grown without rejecting it, embracing the metal over countless decades. The sight stirred an odd sadness. The tree had continued growing, despite carrying a wound. no one remembered making. He reached out and gently rested his fingertips against the bark. The sensation returned immediately. Stronger this time. Not images, not voices. Recognition. As though the tree quietly acknowledged his presence, not as a stranger, but as the newest name added to an impossibly long list it had been keeping since before anyone alive could remember. He slowly withdrew his hand. Somewhere beyond the endless trunks, the last light of day faded into amber. The forest seemed to breathe with the coming dusk, and for the first time since curiosity had led him onto the western road, the traveler realized a quiet, unsettling truth. He had not been choosing the path. The path had been choosing him. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped gently through the canopy, slipping between countless leaves in pale ribbons that painted the forest floor with patches of silver and gold. The traveler awoke beneath the shelter of an ancient beech, where he had wrapped himself in his wool cloak beside a small fire that had long since surrendered to cool gray ash. He stretched carefully. Every joint politely reminded him that sleeping on roots was a privilege reserved for people with considerably younger backs. "Marvelous," he murmured. "I've reached the age where the ground wins arguments." The trees, as always, offered no opinion. He packed his satchel, stamped out the last trace of the fire, and offered a quiet nod toward the clearing that had sheltered him through the night. It felt appropriate. This forest seemed like the sort of place that appreciated good manners. The morning air smelled of damp bark and fresh moss. Tiny beads of dew clung to spiderwebs stretched between low branches, turning them into delicate strings of crystal whenever sunlight found them. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped steadily against a hollow trunk. The rhythm echoed through the stillness. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded less like a bird searching for insects and more like someone patiently knocking on a very old door. The traveler followed a narrow trail, winding through thick carpets of moss. Unlike yesterday, he stopped trying to guess where it led. Direction had become a rather optimistic concept. Instead, he simply walked. The forest seemed pleased by that decision. The path grew smoother. The undergrowth thinned. Even the branches overhead appeared to part just enough for comfortable passage. Whether that was coincidence or intention, he could not tell. Before long, he reached another stream. This one was wider than the first, though no deeper. Smooth stones rested beneath water, so clear that they looked close enough to touch, even where the current reached his knees. As he searched for a safe crossing, he heard something. Laughter, soft, brief, a child laughing. He froze. The sound came from downstream. He waited. Another laugh drifted through the trees. Then another. Several children now, playing, splashing, calling to one another. He smiled despite himself. At last, other travelers. He followed the sound along the bank. The laughter grew clearer. He rounded a bend. No one. Only the stream slipping over polished rocks beneath leaning willows. The laughter continued. It surrounded him, close enough to feel real, yet nowhere visible. His smile slowly faded. He stood perfectly still. Then he noticed something remarkable. The sounds did not echo. They unfolded. One child's delighted shout overlapped another. A girl squealed as though someone had splashed her. A boy protested dramatically. Another laughed so hard he could barely breathe. The voices blended together with effortless familiarity, not ghostly, not frightening, simply alive. For several long moments, the traveler listened without moving. Gradually, the laughter softened, then drifted away like mist beneath the morning sun. The stream resumed its quiet murmur. Nothing else remained, except an unexpected warmth inside his chest. He had never seen those children, yet somehow he missed them. He knelt beside the water and dipped his fingers into the current. Cold, perfectly ordinary. He whispered almost without thinking. They were here. Not are. Were. The realization settled gently upon him. The forest had not created those voices. It had remembered them. He remained there longer than intended. Eventually he stood and continued walking. The trail climbed steadily uphill, through towering oaks whose roots twisted across the earth like enormous sleeping serpents. Thick moss softened every step. The deeper he traveled, the older everything appeared. Branches wore curtains of pale green lichen. Massive stones leaned beneath blankets of ferns. Entire fallen trees had become gardens for smaller plants, insects, and mushrooms. Life patiently built itself upon life. Curiously, medieval foresters sometimes called fallen trees nurse logs long before natural philosophers understood why. They noticed young saplings often grew strongest from rotting trunks, as though the old forest quietly raised the next generation. The traveler found the thought comforting. Perhaps nothing truly disappeared here. Perhaps everything simply changed its role. A pair of squirrels raced along an overhead branch, chasing one another with astonishing determination. One paused directly above him. It stared. Its tiny paws clutched an acorn nearly half the size of its head. The squirrel looked offended, as though the traveler had interrupted an important appointment. "I'll be gone shortly." The squirrel flicked its tail. An acorn cap landed squarely on his shoulder. He looked up. The squirrel had already vanished. Very mature. Even woodland creatures, it seemed, possessed excellent comedic timing. Near midday, the forest changed again. The trees spread farther apart. Soft hills rolled beneath carpets of emerald moss. Sunlight danced across patches of tiny blue flowers. The air carried the scent of pine resin, warmed by gentle light. Everything felt strangely familiar, not because he had visited before, because something inside him recognized the place. A curious sensation tugged quietly at the edge of memory. Then he heard voices once more. Adult voices this time. A man speaking slowly. A woman answering. Their words floated between the trunks like drifting smoke. Unlike the children's laughter, these voices formed complete sentences. "The harvest will be enough. We should return before dusk. He'll worry if we're late." The traveler turned toward the sound. There, between two ancient beeches, he caught the faintest glimpse of movement. Not bodies, only shifting impressions, like sunlight, briefly taking human shape before dissolving again. He stepped closer. The voices continued. "Remember where we buried it. The old ash tree. No one else knows." He blinked. The figures vanished. The voices lingered a heartbeat longer. Then silence reclaimed the woods. He stood motionless. His pulse remained calm. Oddly calm. Perhaps because the forest never presented these memories as frightening. They simply existed, like birdsong, like flowing water, like wind. He wondered how many lives had unfolded beneath these branches. Thousands? Tens of thousands? Every argument, every promise, every shared meal, every farewell. The sheer weight of remembered days staggered the imagination. He rested one hand against a nearby oak. "I wonder if you remember the first person who ever leaned against you." The bark felt warm despite the cool air. No answer came. Yet for just an instant, he sensed enormous patience. Not human patience, tree patience. The kind measured not by hours, but by centuries. Nearby, a single leaf drifted lazily downward. It landed upon his sleeve. Golden, perfectly shaped. He lifted it carefully. Its veins spread outward, like tiny rivers across delicate parchment. Then another whisper reached him, barely audible. An elderly voice, soft, kind. "You always hurry." The traveler looked around. No one. The voice continued. "You miss so much." He frowned. Those words, they reminded him of someone. Someone from long ago. An old neighbor. His grandfather? A passing pilgrim? The memory refused to settle. Instead, it remained frustratingly close, hovering just beyond reach. He slipped the golden leaf into his satchel without quite knowing why. Perhaps because it felt important. Perhaps because everyone occasionally collects meaningless treasures that somehow become priceless later. The afternoon passed peacefully. He encountered no roads, no villages, no fellow travelers, only trees, streams, birds, and scattered echoes of lives that had quietly dissolved into history. As evening approached, the whispers became more frequent, not louder, simply more numerous. Tiny fragments surrounded him. A woman humming while gathering herbs, someone telling an old joke, a father teaching his son how to sharpen a knife safely. Two sisters arguing over berries, an exhausted traveler thanking heaven for dry boots. One voice laughed so unexpectedly that the traveler found himself laughing as well. He had absolutely no idea what the joke had been. Yet the joy lingered anyway. The forest remembered emotion just as faithfully as words. As twilight settled beneath the ancient canopy, he realized he no longer felt alone. Not because someone walked beside him, because countless forgotten lives had once walked these same paths. Their footsteps had faded, their names had vanished, yet somehow their ordinary moments endured. And as the first evening stars quietly appeared beyond the highest branches, the traveler understood that the forest that remembered everything was beginning to share its memories with him. Not all at once, but gently, one forgotten life at a time. The traveler no longer measured his journey by miles. Distance had become an unreliable companion beneath the endless canopy. Instead, he counted streams crossed, ancient stones passed, and memories heard. It was a peculiar way to travel, but then again, this was a peculiar forest. Morning arrived beneath a veil of pale mist. The fog drifted lazily between the trunks, wrapping every oak and pine in soft silver. Branches appeared and disappeared as though the woods were breathing. The traveler walked quietly, finding himself reluctant to disturb the calm. Even his boots seemed to understand. They landed more gently upon the moss than they ever had upon ordinary roads. Somewhere ahead, a bell rang, just once, a single clear note, not loud, not distant, simply present. He stopped immediately. A church, a monastery, perhaps a village hidden among the trees. He listened. Nothing. The bell did not ring again. Instead, a blackbird began singing somewhere above him. Its cheerful melody filled the silence so completely that the lonely bell might never have sounded at all. He smiled. I suppose I'll never know. The forest seemed quite comfortable, leaving questions unanswered. As the mist slowly lifted, he noticed that the trees ahead stood unusually far apart. Their trunks formed a wide circle around an open meadow bathed in soft morning light. Wildflowers still bloomed there despite the advancing autumn. White blossoms, purple bells, golden clusters, no larger than a thumbnail. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. Butterflies floated through the air without the slightest concern for schedules, responsibilities, or taxes. A truly enviable lifestyle. Near the center of the meadow sat a man. Or rather, someone who looked like a man. He wore a faded brown cloak patched so many times that no one could confidently identify its original color. His beard reached nearly to his chest. His hair hung loose beneath a hood woven from coarse wool. He sat cross-legged upon a flat stone, gently carving a small piece of wood with a simple knife. He did not appear surprised by the traveler's arrival. Without looking up, he spoke. You took the western road. His voice was calm, warm, as old as the trees around him. The traveler blinked. I did. You were advised not to. I was. The old man nodded once. They always advise against curiosity. A faint smile crossed the traveler's face. It rarely listens. No. The old man chuckled softly. It never has. The traveler approached cautiously. The stranger continued carving. Tiny curls of fresh wood fell into the grass around his feet. Only when the traveler stood a few paces away did he notice what was being carved. A leaf, perfectly shaped, every vein carefully traced with astonishing precision. You carve beautifully. I remember carefully. The answer seemed oddly chosen. The traveler sat upon a nearby stone. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, not empty, like two old friends watching rain without feeling compelled to discuss the weather. Finally, the traveler asked, "Do you live here?" The old man tilted his head. "I remain here. I suppose that's close enough. For most people." The traveler studied him more closely. His clothes were worn, but clean. His boots had been repaired countless times. Fine lines surrounded bright gray eyes that carried an unusual steadiness. Not the sharp alertness of soldiers, not the restless curiosity of merchants. Something quieter. Someone who had spent many years listening rather than speaking. "You know this forest well." "I know what it allows me to know." "And what is that?" The old man looked toward the towering branches overhead. "That remembering and knowing are not the same thing." The traveler considered that. "I don't understand." "Most people don't." The old man set aside the unfinished carving. "The forest remembers everything. So I've begun to notice. It remembers footsteps. I believe that. It remembers laughter. I've heard it. It remembers grief." The traveler remained silent. The old man continued. "It remembers promises. Promises. Every promise spoken beneath these branches." The traveler frowned. "Surely that's impossible." The old man smiled gently. "So is an acorn becoming an oak." He had a point. The forest excelled at making impossible things appear surprisingly reasonable. The old man reached beside the stone and picked up an acorn. It rested easily in his weathered palm. So small, he rolled it between his fingers. Inside this sleeps a tree that may watch 10 generations of kings rise and fall. He placed it back upon the moss. Impossible things are often merely patient. The traveler found himself unexpectedly fond of that sentence. A gentle breeze wandered across the meadow. The flowers swayed together. Somewhere nearby, bees hummed contentedly. The old man resumed carving. After a while, the traveler asked, "Are you its keeper?" The knife stopped. For the first time, the old man looked directly into his eyes. "No." "Then what are you?" The answer came after a long pause. "I stayed. Nothing more." The traveler waited. Surely more explanation would follow. None came. Apparently, the old man considered those 2 words perfectly sufficient. It was mildly infuriating, like asking for directions and receiving a poem instead. At length, the traveler laughed quietly. "You speak like monks." The old man grinned. "No. Worse? We have more trees." The traveler laughed aloud. Even the meadow seemed brighter afterward. Curiously, throughout parts of medieval Europe, solitary woodland hermits were occasionally sought out, not because people believed they possessed magical powers, but because years spent living quietly in nature often earned them reputations for extraordinary wisdom. Whether deserved or exaggerated depended entirely on whom you asked. The traveler suspected this man belonged somewhere between wisdom and mystery. "You said the forest remembers promises." "I did." "Why?" The old man carefully brushed wood shavings from his lap. "It remembers everything." "But why promises in particular?" Because promises change futures. The traveler nodded slowly. I suppose they do. A promise kept may save generations. And a broken one? The old man's smile faded. It echoes. Silence settled once more. The traveler thought about the countless whispered conversations he had heard. The laughter, the ordinary voices, the forgotten lives. Perhaps somewhere among those echoes lived promises fulfilled, and others abandoned. The thought made the forest feel deeper than before. Not physically, morally, emotionally. As though every choice left gentle rings spreading outward across centuries. The old man stood. Despite his age, he moved with surprising ease. Walk with me. They crossed the meadow together. No path marked their direction. Yet somehow, the grass bent naturally before the old man's feet. Birds continued singing overhead. A fox briefly appeared between nearby ferns. It looked toward them, then calmly trotted away without fear. He knows you, the traveler observed. The old man shrugged. I've disappointed him very little. That's an admirable goal. For friendships. They reached an enormous ash tree, standing alone upon a small rise. Its trunk was scarred with age. One great limb had fallen decades earlier, yet the tree continued growing with quiet determination. The old man rested his hand upon its bark. You hear voices. Yes. You see moments. Sometimes. You feel memories. The traveler hesitated. Yes. The old man nodded. The forest has begun opening itself. Why me? It asked the same question. The traveler blinked. It asked? The old man smiled faintly. Not with words. What did you answer? I didn't. Why not? Because the forest already knew. The breeze stirred again. Leaves drifted gently around them. The traveler placed his own hand upon the ash tree. Immediately. He felt it. Not one memory. Not 10. Hundreds. Thousands. Tiny impressions layered gently together. A child, hiding behind the trunk during a game. Two young lovers, carving initials that the bark had long since swallowed. A grieving mother resting her forehead against the wood. An old shepherd sleeping in the shade. Pilgrims praying. Soldiers passing without stopping. Hunters sharing bread. A frightened girl finding shelter during a storm. No names, only lives. Ordinary, beautiful, fragile. He opened his eyes slowly. The old man was watching him with quiet understanding. You see, the traveler whispered, it doesn't remember heroes. The old man smiled. It remembers everyone. The realization settled more deeply than any memory he had yet experienced. Kings filled chronicles, battles filled songs, but forests remembered the people. History never bothered to write down, and somehow that felt infinitely more precious. The old man did not ask the traveler to follow him. He simply began walking. That, the traveler had noticed, was the forest's preferred way of offering invitations. Nothing was demanded. Nothing was explained before its proper time. You either walked forward or remained where you stood. The traveler chose to walk. The meadow gradually disappeared behind them as the trees closed once more around the narrow trail. Sunlight filtered through countless leaves, turning the air itself into shifting ribbons of green and gold. Neither man hurried. There seemed little point. The forest had existed long before either of them had taken their first breath, and it gave every impression that it would continue quite happily after their last. After a time, the traveler broke the silence. You said you stayed. I did. You never told me why. The old man smiled without looking back. I didn't? No. I suppose the answer changes depending on the season. That sounds suspiciously like avoiding the question. It usually is. The traveler laughed. I was afraid of that. The old man finally glanced over his shoulder. you'll discover that forests answer differently than people. How so? They rarely answer the question you ask. Instead, they answer the question you should have asked. The traveler rubbed the bridge of his nose. I preferred roads. So did I. And yet, here we are. The path dipped gently into a shallow valley where enormous roots rose from the earth like frozen waves. Moss covered every surface in thick green cushions, muffling each step until the two men seemed to drift rather than walk. The traveler noticed something curious. The ground ahead was marked with footprints, not fresh ones, not old ones either. Simply present, hundreds of them. They crossed the valley in every direction. Large boots, small sandals, bare feet, children's prints no bigger than his hand. Animal tracks mingled among them without disturbing the pattern. Foxes, deer, dogs, even tiny bird tracks danced across patches of soft earth. Yet the valley itself remained untouched by rain. No mud, no puddles, only perfectly preserved impressions. He slowed. These should have disappeared years ago. The old man nodded. They should, but they haven't. No. The traveler crouched beside the nearest footprint. Its edges remained astonishingly sharp. He reached out, hesitated, and gently rested his fingertips inside the print. Immediately, the world around him softened, not vanished, softened. The valley remained visible, but another image quietly unfolded over it. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, running, laughing so hard he nearly stumbled over his own feet. Behind him came a large, shaggy dog with ears far too big for the rest of its body. The animal bounded through the valley with complete enthusiasm and absolutely no dignity. The boy looked back. "You'll never catch me!" The dog immediately caught him. Both disappeared into a heap of laughter, grass, and wildly wagging tails. The traveler smiled. The vision dissolved as gently as morning mist. He looked at the old man. I knew exactly how happy he was. You did. I didn't merely see it. No, I felt it. The old man gave a quiet nod. The forest remembers more than events. It remembers feelings. Yes. The traveler stood slowly. Another footprint waited nearby. This one belonged to someone much older. Without thinking, he touched it. A different memory unfolded. An elderly woman, her back slightly bent, a basket hanging from one arm. She gathered mushrooms with practiced care, humming an old melody beneath her breath. Every so often, she paused to pat the trunk of a passing tree, not out of superstition, out of habit, the sort of habit formed over decades. At one point, she stopped beside an oak. "Thank you." She spoke the words aloud, then continued gathering mushrooms. Nothing extraordinary happened. No magical light, no mysterious voice answered. Yet the gratitude itself lingered in the air long after the memory faded. The traveler withdrew his hand. I don't even know her name. The old man looked around the valley. Neither do I. But she mattered. Of course. The traveler looked again at the countless footprints stretching through the moss. Every impression belonged to someone who had laughed, worried, hoped, mourned, celebrated, or simply lived an ordinary day. History rarely bothered with such people. Kings received chronicles, generals earned songs, but who remembered the woman grateful for mushrooms? Who remembered the child racing his impossible dog? Apparently, the forest did. Curiously, many medieval villages believed that well-worn footpaths carried something of those who traveled them. While few imagined literal memories remained, people often avoided mocking old roads, believing countless unseen lives had given those paths their quiet dignity. The traveler suddenly understood why. He walked farther into the valley. Every few steps, Another footprint appeared. Each invited another glimpse. A carpenter carefully balancing fresh-cut boards. Two sisters carrying buckets of berries while arguing about whose turn it was to fetch water. A shepherd falling asleep beneath warm afternoon sunlight while his sheep demonstrated absolutely no respect for organized grazing. One particularly stubborn sheep wandered directly into a thorn bush. The shepherd sighed with the exhausted expression known universally by anyone responsible for creatures determined to invent new problems. The traveler laughed aloud. "I've never even owned sheep." "You don't need to." The old man smiled. "Stubbornness translates remarkably well." They continued together. Eventually the footprints grew larger, heavier, soldiers. Several dozen had passed through long ago. The traveler hesitated before touching one. The memory arrived immediately. Men marched beneath gray skies. No one spoke. Their armor creaked softly with every step. Faces remained tired rather than fierce. One young soldier quietly reached into his pouch and removed a tiny wooden horse. He smiled sadly before placing it back. His daughter had carved it for him. The traveler never learned whether the soldier returned home. The memory ended before the answer came. He stood in silence. The old man waited patiently. They were afraid. Yes, I expected anger. Fear usually arrives first. The traveler nodded. It felt true. A breeze wandered through the valley. Hundreds of leaves drifted slowly across the preserved footprints without covering them. The impressions remained visible, as though the earth itself refused to forget. Ahead stood an enormous stone, unlike any he had yet encountered. Its surface rose taller than three men, standing atop one another. Ancient moss climbed nearly to its summit. Across its face stretched countless shallow carvings. Not words, hands, hundreds of tiny hands. Some belonged to adults, many belonged to children, each carved with remarkable care. The traveler approached in awe. Who made these? No one remembers. The old man smiled gently. Except the forest. He rested one weathered hand upon the stone. For generations, families came here before long journeys. They carved their hands, so they would always have a way back. The traveler placed his own palm beside one of the carvings. His hand was larger. Time had changed many things, yet the simple gesture felt immediately understandable. Everyone wanted to believe some part of them would remain, not from pride, from hope. Hope that they had truly been here, that they had lived, that they had mattered. The old man quietly reached into the folds of his cloak and produced something wrapped in linen. He unfolded it carefully. Inside lay dozens of tiny wooden leaves, each different, each carved with astonishing patience. I make one whenever the forest shares someone with me. The traveler picked one up. On its surface was carved a single smiling face. No name, only joy. You remember them. I try, but there are too many. There always will be. The old man's eyes wandered toward the towering trees. That is why the forest helps. The traveler looked across the valley once more. Thousands upon thousands of footsteps rested peacefully beneath moss and filtered sunlight. No monument marked these lives. No grand history celebrated them. Yet every ordinary choice had left a quiet imprint. And somewhere beneath the endless roots, hidden from every map and every kingdom, the forest that remembered everything continued preserving the footsteps of forgotten kings, wandering pilgrims, laughing children, weary soldiers, grateful grandmothers, and every ordinary soul whose life had rippled gently through the world. The valley of footprints slowly disappeared behind them. The traveler looked back only once. From the crest of a gentle rise, the preserved impressions were almost invisible beneath the dappled light, as though the forest preferred to reveal its treasures only to those willing to walk among them rather than admire them from afar. He found that strangely fitting. Some things could never be appreciated at a distance. The old man continued onward without hesitation. His pace remained unhurried, his footsteps so light that they barely disturbed the blanket of fallen leaves beneath them. The traveler wondered how many times those boots had crossed these woods. Hundreds? Thousands? Perhaps even the old man himself had stopped counting long ago. After a while, the path narrowed until it became little more than a ribbon of moss winding between towering hazel and ash trees. The air grew cooler. Sunlight became scarce. Even the birds sang more softly here, as though they instinctively understood that louder voices did not belong in this part of the forest. Eventually, the traveler noticed something peculiar. Threads, hundreds of them. At first, he mistook them for ordinary spider silk catching the light. But these strands were different. They stretched from trunk to trunk, crossing the path in delicate lines no thicker than a human hair. Some shimmered faintly when sunlight reached them. Others remained almost invisible. None appeared sticky. None belonged to webs. The traveler carefully ducked beneath one. "What are these?" The old man smiled. "You can see them now." "That doesn't answer the question." "No, it rarely does." The old man gently lifted one shimmering strand between two fingers. "It is an oath." The traveler blinked. "An oath?" "A promise." He frowned. "I thought promises were words." "They begin as words." The old man released the strand. It vibrated gently before becoming still once more. "But words have curious roots." The traveler examined another thread, stretching toward an ancient elm. "They're real?" "As real as memory." He reached toward one, then hesitated. "May I touch it?" "You may, but do so gently." He carefully brushed the thread with a fingertip. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not cold, not warm. It felt earnest. That was the only word his mind could offer. And immediately, a scene unfolded. Two young brothers stood beneath these very trees, perhaps 15 years apart in age. The elder knelt before the younger, placing both hands on the boy's shoulders. "I'll come back before winter." The younger brother nodded bravely. "You promise?" "I promise." The older one smiled. "I always keep my promises." The memory ended. The thread continued stretching silently between the trees. The traveler swallowed. Did he return? The old man remained quiet for so long that the traveler thought he hadn't heard. Finally he answered, "I don't know." "The forest doesn't?" "It remembers the promise, but not what happened afterward. The promise was spoken here." The old man looked thoughtfully at the delicate strand. What came after belonged to another place. The traveler considered that. The forest remembered what entered its care. No more, no less. They walked deeper into the grove. Soon, dozens of shimmering threads surrounded them. Some hung low, others stretched high above their heads. Together, they formed a delicate network that caught tiny droplets of morning dew. Each drop sparkled like a suspended star. The sight was breathtaking. No cathedral window could have rivaled such quiet beauty. Curiously, medieval folklore occasionally described sacred groves where spoken vows were believed to linger among the trees. While these tales varied from region to region, many shared the comforting belief that sincere promises became part of the land itself, even after the speakers were gone. Perhaps such stories had begun in places very much like this one. The traveler noticed that not every thread looked alike. Some glowed softly. Others appeared faded. A few shimmered with remarkable brightness. What makes them different? The old man reached toward a thread that shone with warm golden light. Hope. Then he touched another, almost transparent. Regret. The traveler looked puzzled. I thought these were promises. They are. So why regret? The old man smiled sadly. Because not every promise survives the people who make it. They continued onward. A gentle breeze wandered through the grove. To the traveler's surprise, the threads did not sway wildly. Instead, each vibrated with its own quiet rhythm. Together, they produced the faintest sound imaginable. Not quite music, not quite whispering. Something between both. Like distant voices, humming a lullaby too old for anyone to remember completely. He closed his eyes. The sound wrapped around him with astonishing gentleness. There was no sadness in it, only longing, the kind that belonged equally to joyful reunions and painful farewells. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed something near the roots of a great oak. Several threads ended there, or perhaps began there. It was impossible to tell. They disappeared into a hollow beneath the tree, where moss covered everything in thick emerald cushions. The old man knelt. This place has many visitors. The traveler looked around. I don't see anyone. You aren't meant to. The old man brushed aside a few fallen leaves. Hidden beneath them lay dozens of tiny objects. A child's carved whistle, a smooth river stone, a tiny woven bracelet, a wooden spoon no longer than his thumb, a faded ribbon, nothing valuable, everything precious. What are these? Things left behind. For whom? The old man replaced the leaves carefully. For promises. The traveler sat beside him. They offered gifts? Not gifts. The old man shook his head. Reminders. He picked up the tiny whistle. A father promised to teach his daughter music. He touched the ribbon. A woman promised never to forget her sister. Then the spoon. A boy promised his grandmother he would always taste her soup before adding salt. The traveler couldn't help smiling. That's oddly specific. The old man's eyes twinkled. The best promises usually are. The traveler laughed. I suppose no one ever promised to become mysteriously important. No. They promised to mend roofs. Often. Milk goats. Regularly. Remember birthdays? The old man frowned thoughtfully. We measured years differently. Fair point. They both laughed. The sound drifted gently through the grove before disappearing among the ancient trunks. For a while, neither spoke. The traveler found himself thinking about promises he had made throughout his own life. Some fulfilled, some delayed, some forgotten entirely. He wondered, did forgotten promises simply fade, or did they remain somewhere, quietly waiting to be remembered? The thought settled heavily, though not unpleasantly. At length the old man stood. There is one more thing. He led the traveler to the center of the grove. There stood an ancient yew unlike any tree he had ever seen. Its trunk had split centuries earlier, creating a hollow large enough for two people to stand inside. Yet despite its age and scars, fresh green branches continued reaching toward the sky. The old man rested one hand against its bark. This tree remembers every oath spoken beneath its branches. Every one? Every one. The traveler stepped closer. The hollow invited silence. Without fully understanding why, he entered. Inside, the air felt wonderfully cool. The scent of old wood surrounded him. He closed his eyes. Nothing happened. Then, very softly, thousands of voices, not all at once, one after another. I'll return. I forgive you. I'll plant another. You won't face winter alone. I'll carry your name. I'll wait. I'll learn. I'll stay. Simple words, ordinary words, yet spoken with complete sincerity. They rose and faded like gentle waves upon a quiet shore. No single voice lingered longer than another. Kings and shepherds, children and grandparents, rich and poor. The tree made no distinction. Every promise carried equal weight. The traveler opened his eyes slowly. He placed one hand upon the ancient wood. "I understand now." The old man smiled from outside the hollow. "Do you? The forest doesn't keep promises because they're grand. No, it keeps them because someone meant them." The old man's smile widened. "Exactly." Above them, sunlight finally broke through the canopy. Golden light streamed across the grove, illuminating hundreds upon hundreds of delicate threads stretching silently between the ancient trees, an invisible tapestry of forgotten vows, still quietly connecting lives. Long after the voices that had spoken them had fallen silent. The trail bent gently around a hillside where the morning mist lingered longer than anywhere else in the forest. The traveler had long since stopped wondering why. Some places simply preferred to keep their secrets wrapped in soft gray silence. He walked without haste, allowing the cool air to fill his lungs. Every breath carried the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and distant rain. Somewhere overhead, unseen birds exchanged cheerful calls that echoed from branch to branch. It sounded almost like neighbors greeting one another before beginning the day's work. A pleasant custom, far better than waking to someone announcing taxes. The old hermit had remained behind hours earlier. Not because they had argued, not because he had disappeared. He had simply smiled beside an ancient ash tree and said, "The forest knows the rest." Then he had sat upon a fallen log and resumed carving another wooden leaf. The traveler understood, or at least he thought he did. Some lessons were meant to be walked alone. The path eventually opened into a glade unlike any he had yet seen. Instead of towering oaks, dozens of slender silver birches surrounded a small pond, so still that the sky appeared to have settled upon its surface. No breeze disturbed the water. Even floating leaves remained perfectly motionless. He approached carefully. When he looked into the pond, he expected to see his own reflection. Instead, he saw another man, an elderly baker, dusted with flour from head to toe, laughing as children stole warm bread from a cooling table. The baker noticed them, pretended not to. His smile grew wider. The image faded. Ripples crossed the pond. His own reflection returned. The traveler blinked. "Well," he muttered, "that was certainly unexpected." He knelt beside the water. Again, another reflection appeared. This time, an old woman sat beneath an apple tree, mending a child's cloak while humming softly to herself. Nothing remarkable happened. No miracle, no grand adventure, only a peaceful afternoon shared between generations, yet watching it filled him with quiet contentment. He realized something curious. The forest never seemed interested in extraordinary moments. It treasured ordinary happiness. Perhaps because ordinary happiness disappears so easily unless someone remembers it. A dragon slayer might earn songs. But who sang about the grandmother who always left the warmest seat beside the fire for visiting grandchildren? The forest, apparently. It had excellent priorities. A king's victory lasted a season. Fresh bread shared freely could warm someone's memory for a lifetime. He smiled at the thought. Nearby, dragonflies skimmed across the pond like tiny blue arrows. Their wings flashed in the sunlight before vanishing into the reeds. Curiously, many medieval villagers believed dragonflies were harmless guardians of clean water, and children were often told never to disturb them. Whether the insects appreciated the compliment remains unknown, but they certainly behaved as though they owned every pond they visited. After resting for a while, the traveler continued. The birches gave way to towering chestnut trees whose broad leaves whispered softly above him. Soon he began noticing another peculiar thing. Songs, not voices this time. Melodies. Someone, long ago, had sung beneath these branches, often enough that the tunes themselves seemed unwilling to leave. One melody rose gently like a lullaby. Another carried the lively rhythm of a harvest dance. A third sounded almost playful, as though someone had invented it simply to amuse children during a long walk home. The traveler found himself humming along before realizing he had never heard any of them before. Yet somehow, he already knew them. Perhaps memory did not always belong to the one who first lived it. Perhaps joy traveled more easily than names. A squirrel darted across the trail, carrying a chestnut nearly too large for its tiny body. Halfway across, it dropped the nut, stared at it, stared at the traveler, then appeared to blame him entirely for the inconvenience. He politely looked away. Some arguments were impossible to win. By afternoon, the forest became brighter. Sunlight spilled freely through openings in the canopy, illuminating patches of wild thyme and tiny white flowers scattered between the roots. Bees drifted lazily among them. The traveler sat upon a warm stone to eat the last of his bread. A robin landed nearby. It watched him expectantly. "I've already shared breakfast with enough woodland creatures." The robin remained. He sighed dramatically. "You negotiate exactly like monks." He broke off a tiny crumb. The robin accepted the offering with obvious satisfaction before flying away. Apparently, diplomacy still had its place. As the shadows lengthened, the traveler reached the crest of a gentle hill. Beyond it stretched another sea of ancient trees, endless, peaceful, patient. For the first time since entering the forest, he no longer searched for the quickest road home. Instead, he wondered how many forgotten smiles rested beneath those distant branches. How many songs. How many quiet acts of kindness. How many ordinary lives had become part of the great memory, sleeping beneath roots older than kingdoms. The thought no longer unsettled him. It comforted him. If every gentle word truly left an echo somewhere, then perhaps no kindness was ever as small as it seemed. The evening breeze wandered through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest trace of an old melody. The traveler listened until the final note dissolved into the growing twilight. Then, with a quiet smile, he stepped forward beneath the waiting canopy, ready to discover whatever forgotten memory the forest might choose to share next. By the following dawn, the mist had lifted from the lower hills, leaving countless droplets clinging to every fern and blade of grass. The traveler followed a faint game trail that wound between ancient hazel trees, each one bent into graceful arches by centuries of wind. The forest felt awake in a different way than before. It was not the awakening of bustling villages, where doors opened and ovens warmed. Here, the day began almost silently. A robin tested a single note before committing to its full song. Somewhere deeper among the pines, a stag crossed a shallow stream with slow, deliberate steps. Even the breeze seemed to arrive carefully, as though unwilling to disturb memories resting beneath the roots. The traveler smiled. He had begun matching the forest's pace without realizing it. There had been a time when every journey demanded speed. Messages had deadlines. Markets closed before sunset. Ferrymen refused late crossings, but these woods measured time differently. Nothing hurried. Nothing lagged behind. Everything arrived exactly when it was ready. He paused beside an enormous fallen oak whose trunk had become covered in velvet moss. Tiny mushrooms climbed its side in neat rows, looking remarkably like a collection of miniature stools prepared for woodland storytellers. "If they're expecting an audience," he whispered, "I hope someone remembers to bring soup." A squirrel froze halfway up the trunk. It stared at him for several seconds. Then, with impeccable timing, it continued climbing without acknowledging the joke in the slightest. A difficult crowd. He continued onward. Before long, he noticed something unusual hanging from a low branch. It was not fruit, nor a bird's nest. It was a tiny woven ring made from dried grasses and willow fibers, no larger than the palm of his hand. Another hung farther ahead. Then another, each one slightly different. Some were decorated with feathers, others with acorn caps, or small sprigs of lavender that had long since dried. They turned gently in the morning air. No two were alike. The traveler reached the first one, but stopped before touching it. He remembered what the old hermit had said. Not everything in the forest asked to be handled. Some things simply wished to be noticed, so he bowed his head ever so slightly and walked on. As he did, the rings stirred together in the breeze, producing the softest rustling sound. Not words, not music, more like the pleasant murmur of neighbors speaking outside their cottages on a warm summer evening. It was enough to make the forest feel wonderfully inhabited without anyone being visible. A little farther along, the trail crossed a brook no wider than a wagon wheel. Flat stones formed a natural bridge. Each stone bore the smooth shine that only countless footsteps could create. He stepped onto the first, then the second. On the third, he paused. Someone had carved the outline of a tiny bird into its surface many generations before. The carving had nearly disappeared beneath time, but not entirely. It reminded him that even small gestures could outlive their makers. He found himself wondering who had carved it. A child? A shepherd? Someone waiting for a friend who arrived much later than expected? The forest offered no answer, only the quiet invitation to keep wondering. And somehow, that was enough. By midday, he emerged into a sunlit clearing where tall grasses rippled like waves beneath the wind. At its center stood a single pear tree, astonishingly old, yet still bearing a handful of late fruit. One pear dropped gently onto the grass just as he approached. He looked upward. No objections if I accept your generosity. Nothing happened. A leaf drifted lazily onto his shoulder. I'll take that as permission. The pear was firm, sweet, and surprisingly cool. Perhaps it was the finest fruit he had ever tasted, or perhaps every meal becomes memorable when eaten beneath branches that had watched centuries pass. He sat in the shade until the afternoon light softened. Then, shouldering his satchel once more, he followed the narrow path leading beyond the clearing. The woods welcomed him again with their patient silence, and somewhere ahead, beyond the next rise and the next stand of ancient oaks, another forgotten story seemed already to be waiting for someone willing to walk slowly enough to hear it. The path beyond the pear tree descended into a quieter part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together and the ground became soft with layers upon layers of fallen leaves. The traveler noticed something unusual almost immediately. The forest floor was covered with tiny lantern-like flowers. They were not bright enough to illuminate the woods, but each pale blossom seemed to hold a small drop of morning light within its petals. They appeared wherever old roots crossed the earth. They appeared beside stones. They appeared near forgotten paths. It was as if the forest had carefully placed little reminders that even hidden places deserved a bit of beauty. The traveler crouched beside one. You're very dramatic for a flower. A gentle breeze moved through the clearing. The flower swayed. He nodded thoughtfully. I suppose that was your answer. He had begun speaking to plants, a strange habit. Though, considering the company he had kept recently, it was hardly the strangest thing that had happened. He continued deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler, and the scent of pine became stronger. Tall trees surrounded him on every side, their trunks rising like pillars, supporting a ceiling made of leaves. Eventually, he reached a small stone cottage. It was not abandoned. Smoke curled gently from a chimney. A stack of firewood rested neatly beside the entrance. A small garden grew nearby, filled with herbs, onions, and flowers, planted without much concern for organized rows. The garden looked less like a farmer's work and more like nature had simply decided to decorate. An elderly woman stepped outside carrying a wooden basket. She looked at the traveler without surprise. "You took the northern path." The traveler smiled. "Apparently everyone knows where I walk before I do." The woman laughed softly. "The forest is generous with information." She placed the basket on a nearby table. Inside were herbs, mushrooms, and small bundles of dried leaves. "Are you lost?" The traveler considered the question. A week earlier, he would have answered immediately. Now he paused. "I don't know." The woman nodded. That is usually the more honest answer. She invited him to sit beneath a tree beside the cottage. There was no ceremony, no grand introduction, just the simple kindness of someone offering a tired traveler a place to rest. She poured warm herbal tea into a wooden cup. The traveler accepted it gratefully. "What is this?" "Something calming." "Will it help me understand this forest?" "No." He looked disappointed. "It will help you stop demanding that you understand everything." He laughed. "That may be more difficult. Most useful lessons are." The old woman watched the trees quietly. "I have lived here many years. Are you the keeper of this place?" She smiled. "No." The traveler sighed. "Everyone says that." "Because it is true." "Then what are you?" She looked toward her small garden. "I tend what I can." The answer was simple, yet somehow it carried great weight. She explained that years ago, she had arrived at the forest as a young woman searching for a lost family member. She had followed rumors of strange paths and forgotten groves. She had expected answers. Instead, she found a place that asked her to listen. "And you stayed?" "I did." "Why?" The woman looked at the flowers growing beside her door. "Because I realized I was searching for someone who was gone, while ignoring everyone who was still here." The traveler remained quiet. The forest had a way of making simple sentences feel heavier. She continued. "People often think remembering means holding on to the past. Doesn't it? Sometimes." She picked up a fallen leaf. "But sometimes remembering means understanding what the past gave you." The traveler looked around. The cottage, the garden, the trees, the quiet. Everything seemed built from patience, not from forgetting, from accepting. The woman handed him a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of seeds. "What are these?" "Flowers." "From this forest?" "Some." She smiled. "Some came from travelers who passed through long ago." The traveler looked at the seeds carefully. "Why keep them?" "Because every seed carries a possibility." She closed the box. "Memory is similar." He thought about the voices in the trees, the footprints, the promises, the forgotten laughter. Perhaps memories were not only things left behind. Perhaps they were also things waiting to become something new. As evening approached, the woman prepared a small meal. Nothing extravagant. Bread, cheese, a bowl of warm vegetables. Yet it felt like a feast. The traveler noticed a curious object hanging beside the cottage door. A wooden carving of a bird. Its wings were spread wide. "Did you make that?" "No." "Who did?" The woman smiled. "I don't remember." The traveler laughed. "Then the forest has not told you everything." "No." She looked toward the trees. "That is what makes remembering interesting." The first stars appeared between the branches. The traveler rested beside the cottage that night, listening to the forest settle around him. Leaves whispered, branches creaked, distant animals moved through the darkness. But there was no fear. Only the quiet feeling that countless lives had passed through these woods and left behind small pieces of themselves. Not treasures, not monuments, just moments. A song, a promise, a carved bird, a shared meal, tiny things, the kind of things history often overlooks, but the kind of things that make a life feel complete. and beneath the ancient trees, the traveler slowly understood that the forest did not remember everything because it wanted to preserve the past. It remembered because every life, no matter how small, had something worth carrying forward. The traveler woke before sunrise. For a moment, he did not know where he was. Then he heard the forest, the gentle movement of leaves, the distant call of a bird greeting the morning, the quiet crackle of the old woman's cooking fire. And he remembered. The cottage, the garden, the seeds, the endless trees that carried the traces of countless lives. He sat up slowly beneath the wool blanket that had been offered to him. It was strange. A few days earlier, he would have worried about the road ahead. He would have calculated distances, measured supplies, considered every possible inconvenience. Now he simply watched the first rays of light enter the forest. Somewhere along the way, the need to control every step had quietly disappeared. The forest had taught him something no map could explain. Sometimes the journey became clearer when you stopped trying to force it. The old woman was already outside. She moved through her garden carefully, touching leaves and checking small plants as though greeting old friends. The traveler approached. "Do they need so much attention?" The woman looked over her shoulder. "Everything does. Even trees, especially trees." He smiled. "Trees seem rather independent." "They are." She adjusted a small branch growing in the wrong direction. "But independence is not the same as needing nothing." The traveler considered that. It was an answer that applied to more than forests. After breakfast, the woman handed him the wooden box of seeds. He looked surprised. "You want me to take these?" "I want you to decide where they belong." "How will I know?" The woman smiled. "You'll know." He looked down at the box. That was not the most practical instruction he had ever received. In fact, it was probably among the least practical. Yet somehow, in this forest, it sounded perfectly reasonable. Before leaving, he thanked her. The woman only nodded. "Remember something." "What?" "The forest does not keep memories to trap people in yesterday." She looked toward the trees. "It keeps them so tomorrow does not forget where it came from." The traveler carried those words with him long after the cottage disappeared behind the trees. The path ahead was unfamiliar, but unfamiliar no longer meant frightening. It simply meant unwritten. The forest became denser as he traveled. Massive roots twisted beneath his feet. Vines climbed ancient trunks. Moss covered fallen branches until they resembled sleeping creatures beneath green blankets. At midday, he reached a clearing where dozens of small stones stood upright in the earth. At first, he thought they were grave markers, but as he approached, he noticed something different. Each stone carried a simple carving: a cup, a hammer, a flower, a feather, a fish, a loaf of bread, a wooden wheel. Symbols, not names. He touched the nearest stone. A memory unfolded. A young craftsman shaping a wooden bowl. His hands moved with incredible patience. He paused often to admire the grain of the wood, not because anyone would notice, not because he expected praise, simply because he loved making something useful and beautiful. The memory faded. The traveler touched another stone, a woman weaving cloth beside a window. Sunlight fell across her hands. She hummed quietly. The room around her was simple, but she smiled as though she possessed everything she needed. Another stone, a fisherman repairing a net. Another, a farmer planting the first seeds of spring. Another, a child carefully placing flowers beside a sleeping dog. The traveler stepped back. These were not the stories that filled royal halls. No battles, no crowns, no grand victories, just lives, quiet lives, important lives. He sat among the stones for a long time. The forest had shown him many memories, but this place felt different. These were not memories of events. They were memories of effort, of ordinary people creating, repairing, caring, and continuing. Curiously, many medieval communities marked important places with simple symbols because written records were rare. A sign carved into wood or stone could carry meaning for generations, even when the people who created it were long gone. Perhaps that was why these stones felt familiar. They were not trying to tell stories. They were trying to remind anyone who passed that stories existed everywhere. The traveler opened the small wooden box. The seeds rested inside. He wondered where they belonged. Then he noticed an empty space between the stones, a place where nothing grew. The soil looked healthy. The sunlight reached it perfectly. It simply waited. He knelt and planted several seeds. No thunder, no magical transformation, no sudden flowers blooming beneath his hands. Just soil. A small action, a quiet beginning. He smiled. Perhaps that was the point. Not everything meaningful announced itself. Some things simply started. The traveler continued walking until evening. The path eventually brought him beside a narrow river. The water moved slowly, reflecting the orange colors of sunset. He sat on the bank and listened. Then he heard something familiar. Laughter, not from a memory, not from the past. Real laughter. He turned. A family stood on the opposite bank. A father carrying a bundle of firewood, a mother holding a basket, two children chasing one another between the trees. They waved when they noticed him. He waved back. For a brief moment, the traveler felt something unusual. The forest was not only showing him what had been, it was showing him what still was. Life had not ended beneath these branches. It continued. New footsteps joined old ones. New voices joined forgotten songs. New memories were already forming. The realization filled him with a quiet joy. The forest remembered everything. But it was never only a place of echoes. It was also a place of beginnings. As darkness settled over the river, the traveler prepared his small camp beneath a wide oak. Before sleeping, he looked once more toward the trees. Somewhere beyond them were countless forgotten stories. Somewhere ahead were stories not yet created. And somewhere beneath the roots, the forest patiently held them all. The river remained beside the traveler for most of the following day. It moved slowly through the forest, never rushing, never stopping. The traveler found himself admiring that. A river did not worry about arriving somewhere quickly. It simply continued. Perhaps that was another lesson. The forest offered without announcing itself. The morning was bright and cool. Mist hovered above the water like a thin silver veil, and small insects danced above the surface in tiny circles. The traveler packed his belongings and looked at the wooden box of seeds resting beside his satchel. He had planted some already, yet many remained. He wondered where they would eventually find their place. The old woman had said he would know. It was a frustrating answer. Wise, perhaps, but still frustrating. The sort of answer that made a person feel enlightened and mildly annoyed at the same time. He crossed the river using a fallen tree that served as a natural bridge. Halfway across, he stopped. Carved into the bark of the fallen trunk were dozens of small marks, not words, not symbols, little lines, hundreds of them, some deep, some barely visible. He ran his fingers over the oldest ones. Immediately, the forest answered. A memory appeared. A group of villagers standing beside the same tree many years earlier. They were not cutting it down. They were gathering around it. A young boy held a small knife. An older man guided his hand carefully. Only a small mark. The boy nodded. What for? The older man smiled. So we remember we were here. The child carved a tiny line. The memory faded. The traveler looked at the marks again. so simple, so ordinary. Yet each one represented a person who had once stood exactly where he stood. A person who had looked at this tree, touched this bark, taken a breath beneath these branches. The forest carried their presence like a quiet treasure. He continued walking. By midday, the trees changed. The towering giants became smaller and closer together. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating tunnels of green and gold. The path became covered with fallen flowers. Small purple blossoms covered the ground so completely that the traveler wondered if he was walking upon a carpet carefully woven by nature. A few butterflies moved lazily through the air. One landed briefly on his shoulder. He remained perfectly still. The butterfly seemed satisfied. Then it flew away. Another creature who expects excellent manners. The forest, apparently, had standards. Soon he reached a strange structure hidden among the trees. At first, he thought it was a ruined tower. But as he approached, he realized it was something much older and simpler. A circle of standing stones. Each stone was taller than a person. Each one covered with moss. No roof, no walls, just stones arranged beneath the open sky. The traveler stepped inside. Immediately, the air felt different, not colder, quieter. The sounds of the forest seemed distant. The birds, the wind, the moving leaves. Everything softened. At the center of the circle lay a single flat stone. Upon it rested a small wooden object, a toy horse. The traveler stopped. He recognized it, not because he had seen it before, because he had felt it. The memory of the soldier carrying one had remained with him. Slowly, he reached down. The moment his fingers touched the toy, the world shifted. A young child sat beside a cottage door. She carefully carved the little horse while her father watched. "Is it good?" The soldier smiled. "It's perfect. It doesn't look like a horse," he laughed. "Then it is a very rare horse." The child smiled proudly. "I made it for luck." The memory changed. The father walking away, the child waving, the toy horse tucked safely inside his pouch. Then the memory ended. The traveler looked down. The wooden horse remained in his hand. He expected sadness. Instead, he felt gratitude. The child had not known what would happen. The father had not known. Neither had the forest. But the love between them had remained. That was what mattered. He placed the toy back exactly where he found it. Some memories were not meant to be carried away. Some were meant to stay where they belonged. As he left the stone circle, he noticed something carved into the largest stone. A single sentence, not ancient, not mysterious, just simple words. "Those who are remembered walk beside us." The traveler read it twice. Then he smiled. The forest had a way of saying complicated things in very simple ways. That evening, he found shelter beneath a large pine tree. He built a small fire and prepared a modest meal. As the flames flickered, he opened the wooden box again. The remaining seeds rested quietly inside. He chose one, only one. Then he looked around. Nearby stood a small clearing where sunlight reached the earth. He planted the seed. Then he covered it carefully. No ceremony, no expectation, just a promise, a tiny one. But perhaps tiny promises were the ones that mattered most. The traveler sat beside the fire and watched the darkness settle. The forest around him filled with familiar sounds, branches moving, animals traveling, leaves whispering. Yet beneath all of it, he sensed something else. Not a voice, not a memory. Something closer to approval. As though the forest had noticed. Not the planting, not the seed, the intention, the care, the simple choice to add something rather than only take. He rested his head against the tree trunk. For the first time in many days, he did not wonder what awaited him tomorrow. He did not need to know. Tomorrow would arrive, the forest would remember. And perhaps, somewhere among those ancient roots, a tiny new memory had already begun. The seed remained beneath the earth. The traveler knew this because he checked. Twice. Then a third time, just to be certain. He quickly realized that patience was easier to admire when it belonged to someone else. Trees had centuries, seeds had seasons. Travelers had a tendency to become impatient after several minutes. Still, he smiled at himself and continued onward. The forest did not hurry him. It never had. The path ahead led through a region where the trees grew unusually tall and narrow, their branches reaching upward like countless hands trying to touch the same distant piece of sky. The ground was covered with golden leaves. Each step released a soft crunch, a sound that somehow felt both new and ancient. He wondered how many travelers had heard that same sound before him. How many had walked beneath these trees carrying hopes, worries, letters, gifts, and unfinished thoughts. The forest remembered them all. Perhaps that was why walking there felt strangely comforting. Every person who had passed through had left something behind. Not always an object. Sometimes only a moment. A breath. A laugh. A quiet decision. The traveler walked until he reached a small wooden bridge crossing a narrow stream. Unlike the natural bridges he had seen before, this one had clearly been built by human hands. The wood was old. The supports were worn. Moss covered the edges, yet it remained strong. Someone had repaired it many times. He noticed small pieces of different wood woven into its structure. Oak, pine, ash, birch, a bridge made from many generations of care. He placed one foot upon it. Immediately, a memory surfaced. A young man carrying a bundle of tools. He examined the bridge carefully. A companion beside him sighed. Again, the young man laughed. Again. You repaired it last spring, and it needed repairing this spring. The companion shook his head. You could build a new bridge. The young man looked at the old wooden path. No. Why? Because this one has carried too many people to replace. The memory faded. The traveler stood still. A simple bridge, a simple repair, a simple kindness. Yet the forest had preserved it, not because the bridge was impressive, because someone cared. He crossed slowly. On the other side, he found a small clearing filled with carved wooden signs, not directions, not warnings, names, hundreds of names. Some were clear, some were almost gone. Some had become part of the trees growing around them. The traveler approached the nearest sign. A woman's name was carved there. Below it was a tiny flower. He touched the wood. A memory appeared. A young woman planting flowers beside the path. A child asked her why she bothered. No one will know who planted them. The woman smiled. The flowers will know. The child looked confused. They can't talk. No. The woman placed another seed into the soil. But not everything needs a voice to remember. The traveler opened his eyes. The sign stood quietly before him. The flowers around it had long since disappeared. Yet the idea remained. He walked among the signs. Each one carried a different story. A shepherd who helped lost travelers. A healer who gathered herbs for strangers. A craftsman who repaired tools without asking for payment. A farmer who planted extra crops every year in case someone needed them. Ordinary people, extraordinary kindness. The traveler began to understand something. The forest did not remember people because they were important. People became important because the forest remembered them. The distinction mattered. Very much. Near the end of the clearing stood the oldest sign. It had no name, only a symbol, a small open hand. The traveler frowned. Why remember someone without a name? He touched the wood. Nothing happened. No vision, no voice, only silence. He tried again. Still nothing. At first, he felt disappointed. Then he realized something. Perhaps the forest was not showing him everything because some memories did not belong to him. Respect, after all, was another form of remembering. He stepped back. The nameless sign remained. Quiet, unknown, but somehow meaningful. Curiously, many medieval communities preserved stories of unnamed benefactors, people whose acts were remembered even when their names were lost. A bridge repaired, a field shared, or a traveler helped on a difficult road could survive in local memory long after the person themselves disappeared. The traveler sat beside the sign for a while. He wondered if everyone secretly wished for the same thing. Not fame, not songs, just proof that their kindness had reached someone, that their days had mattered, that their small actions had not vanished completely. As afternoon faded, he continued beyond the clearing. The forest began changing once more. The trees became older, larger, more twisted. Their roots formed natural walls around the path. The air carried the scent of rain. Ahead, thunder rumbled softly. The traveler looked upward. Dark clouds gathered above the canopy. A storm was coming. He searched for shelter. Then he noticed something unusual, a small cave opening beneath the roots of an enormous tree. He approached carefully. Inside was dry, warm, and surprisingly comfortable. Someone had clearly used this place before. A small stack of firewood rested against the wall. A smooth stone served as a seat. Nearby lay a collection of small objects, a broken buckle, a child's marble, a carved piece of bone, a faded piece of cloth. The traveler hesitated. Not treasures, not valuable, just forgotten things. He understood immediately. This was not a hiding place. It was a place where lost things waited. He sat quietly as rain began falling outside. The sound filled the forest. 1,000 tiny drops striking leaves, 1,000 tiny rhythms. He looked at the objects beside him. Every lost thing had once belonged to someone. Every object had once been held, used, loved, forgotten, and yet, here they remained. The traveler smiled softly. The forest did not only remember people, it remembered the pieces of their lives, the little things they left behind, the things no one else considered important. Outside, the storm continued. Inside the shelter of ancient roots, the traveler listened to the rain and felt completely at peace. For the first time, he wondered something new. Perhaps the greatest memories were not the ones carved into stone. Perhaps they were the quiet ones, the ones hidden beneath roots, the ones carried in simple objects, the ones kept alive by a forest that understood something humans often forgot. Nothing given with care was ever truly lost. The storm passed during the night. By morning, the forest seemed newly washed. Every leaf carried droplets of water that sparkled beneath the first rays of sunlight. The air smelled of wet bark, fresh earth, and the faint sweetness of flowers opening after the rain. The traveler stepped out from beneath the ancient roots and looked around. The world felt quieter, not empty, rested. Rain had a way of reminding everything to begin again. Small streams appeared where there had only been dry ground the day before. Fallen leaves floated gently along shallow currents. Birds returned one by one, testing their songs as though checking whether the morning was ready for them. The traveler packed his belongings and looked once more at the forgotten objects inside the shelter. He wondered about each one. Who held the broken buckle? Who played with the marble? Who carved the small piece of bone? He knew he would never have the answers. And strangely, he was comfortable with that. Not every mystery needed solving. Some simply deserved respect. He continued along the path. The storm had changed the forest. Branches that had been hidden were now visible. Small flowers that had been covered by leaves stood proudly in the open. Even the ground seemed different, as though the rain had uncovered things that had always been there. After several hours, he reached a place where the trees grew in a perfect circle. At the center stood a single stone well. It was ancient, older than any village nearby, older than many kingdoms. Moss covered the stones, and thick vines curled around its edges. A small wooden bucket hung from a rope beside it. The traveler approached carefully. He looked down. The water below was perfectly still. He expected to see his reflection. Instead, he saw a road, a different road, a road covered in snow. A young traveler walked along it, carrying a heavy pack. The man looked exhausted. Yet he continued. The image shifted. The same traveler years later, older, carrying less, walking more slowly. Then another moment. The man sitting beside a warm fire, telling stories to children. Then another. The traveler, standing beneath these very trees, smiling peacefully. The vision disappeared. The water returned to stillness. The traveler stepped back. He understood. The well was not showing memories of the forest. It was showing possibilities, paths that could be taken, choices waiting ahead. For the first time since entering the woods, he felt uncertain, not afraid, just aware. Every road contained countless versions of a life. Every decision closed some paths and opened others. The forest did not tell him which one to choose. It simply reminded him that choices mattered. A sound interrupted his thoughts. A small bird landed on the edge of the well. It carried a twig in its beak. The bird dropped it beside the bucket. The traveler laughed. "Are you building something?" The bird looked at him, then picked up the twig, then dropped it again. He nodded. Very clear instructions. The bird flew away. Perhaps even nature occasionally enjoyed confusing humans. The traveler sat beside the well for a long time. Eventually, he noticed something carved into the stone. Not words. A simple image. A tree. Its roots spread wide beneath the earth. Its branches reached toward the sky. Between them stood a small figure. Not powerful, not important, just standing. The traveler touched the carving. A memory appeared. A group of villagers gathered around the same well many years earlier. An elder spoke to them. "Do not ask the forest what your future will be." The villagers listened carefully. "Ask what kind of person you wish to become." The memory faded. The traveler looked at the carving again. The lesson felt familiar. The forest never offered easy answers. It offered understanding. By afternoon, he reached a wide meadow where hundreds of tiny white flowers covered the ground. In the center stood a young tree. Small, fragile, new. The traveler immediately recognized the place. Not because he had been there, because he felt it. The seed he had planted days earlier had not grown here, but another seed had, another beginning. He walked closer. The young tree was barely taller than his shoulder. Its leaves were delicate, its trunk thin, yet it stood proudly. A beginning, nothing more, nothing less. He remembered the old woman's words. Everything begins small. He sat beside the young tree. A breeze moved through the meadow. The tiny leaves trembled. The traveler smiled. "You're doing well." The tree, wisely, did not respond. Though he had begun suspecting trees preferred listening, he stayed until sunset. During those quiet hours, he thought about everything the forest had shown him. Footprints, promises, lost objects, forgotten names, small acts of kindness. All these things had one message. A life was not measured only by what it achieved. It was measured by what it touched. A person could disappear from history. Their name could vanish. Their home could crumble. Their possessions could be scattered. But somewhere, something might still remember. A tree, A path, a bridge, a flower, another person. The traveler placed his hand gently against the young tree's trunk, not asking anything, not expecting anything, simply acknowledging that it existed. That was enough. As darkness arrived, he prepared to continue his journey. But before leaving, he looked back at the meadow. The young tree stood quietly beneath the stars, small, new, full of possibilities. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, its roots had already begun creating memories. The traveler left the meadow at dawn. He looked back only once. The young tree stood beneath the morning sky, its small leaves moving gently with the breeze. It seemed impossible that something so delicate could one day become enormous. Yet the forest had taught him that impossible things were often simply patient things. So he walked on. The path ahead became narrower. The trees grew older. Their trunks twisted in strange shapes, and their branches stretched across the sky like careful hands protecting something hidden below. The traveler noticed that the forest was quieter here, not because fewer creatures lived nearby, because everything seemed to be listening. He followed the trail until he reached a place where the ground was covered in smooth stones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They spread across a wide valley between the trees. At first, he thought they were ordinary rocks. Then he noticed the markings. Each stone carried a small carving, a circle, a leaf, a line, a symbol. Some were clear, others had almost disappeared. He walked among them slowly. The stones reminded him of the signs he had seen before, but these felt different. They were not marking promises. They were not preserving footsteps. They were remembering choices. He touched the nearest stone. A memory appeared, a farmer standing at the edge of a field. Two paths stretched before him. One led toward a wealthy estate, the other toward a small village struggling after a difficult winter. The farmer looked uncertain. Then he chose the village. The memory faded. The traveler touched another stone. A young woman holding a letter. She could send it, or keep silent. She chose to speak. The memory disappeared. Another stone. A craftsman deciding whether to repair a broken tool for a stranger. He repaired it. Another. A child deciding whether to share a piece of bread. He shared it. The traveler stepped back. The forest was showing him something it had never shown before. Not what people had done, what they had chosen. The invisible moments. The tiny decisions that changed everything afterward. He sat among the stones. Most lives were not transformed by grand moments. They were shaped by small ones. A kind word, a patient response, a choice made when nobody was watching. Curiously, many medieval stories placed great importance on small acts of generosity, because communities depended on cooperation for survival. A shared meal, a repaired tool, or a helping hand could mean the difference between hardship and hope. The traveler looked across the valley. Perhaps that was why the forest remembered choices, because choices were where people revealed themselves, not in speeches, not in titles, not in the things they claimed to be, but in the quiet moments when they decided what kind of person they wished to become. As he continued through the valley, he found one stone unlike the others. It was larger, older, completely blank, no carving, no symbol, nothing. The traveler stared at it. Every stone around it carried a memory. Why not this one? He placed his hand against its surface. Nothing happened. He waited. Still nothing. He smiled. Not everything has to explain itself. The forest seemed to approve, or perhaps he was simply becoming very comfortable talking to things that could not answer. A reasonable person might have found this unusual. Fortunately, he had spent enough time among ancient trees that his definition of reasonable had changed considerably. He continued walking. By evening, The valley ended. Beyond it stood a hill covered with tall grass. At the top, he found something unexpected. A small wooden sign, not old, not ancient, recently made. It pointed toward two paths. One direction led deeper into the forest. The other led outward, toward the world beyond the trees. The traveler stood between them. For the first time in many days, he understood that the forest was not preventing him from leaving. It never had. It had never trapped him. It had simply allowed him to stay until he understood why he had entered. He sat beneath the sign and watched the sunset. He thought about the roads he had traveled before, the messages delivered, the villages visited, the strangers who had crossed his path. He realized he had spent years carrying other people's words, letters, orders, requests, promises, but he had rarely stopped to consider his own. What did he want to carry forward? What memories did he wish to create? What small choices would one day remain somewhere after he was gone? The answer did not arrive dramatically. There was no sudden revelation, no voice from the trees, only a quiet understanding. He wanted to notice things, the way the old woman noticed flowers, the way the craftsman noticed wood grain, the way the villagers noticed a bridge worth repairing, the way the forest noticed everyone. He opened the wooden box of seeds. Only a few remained. He looked between the two paths. Then he walked to the edge of the forest. There, beside the trail leading outward, he found a patch of untouched soil. He planted another seed, not because he knew what it would become, not because he expected anyone to see it, simply because something deserved a chance to grow. He covered the seed carefully. Then he placed a small stone beside it. No name, no mark, no claim, just a quiet reminder. Someone had been here. Someone had cared. As night settled, the traveler returned to the crossroads. The forest behind him whispered softly, not goodbye, not farewell. Something gentler, like a promise. He looked back at the endless trees. For a moment, he imagined all the memories hidden beneath the branches. Every laugh, every kindness, every choice, every life. Then he turned toward the road beyond the forest. He was leaving, but he was not leaving. Empty-handed. He carried no treasure, no magical artifact, no proof that anyone would believe. Only a handful of seeds, a collection of memories, and a deeper understanding of the simple truth. The forest had guarded for centuries. Everything mattered, even the smallest things, especially the smallest things. The road beyond the forest felt strangely unfamiliar, not because the traveler had never walked it before. He had traveled countless roads. He had crossed valleys, climbed hills, entered villages where no one knew his name, and left places before anyone had learned it. But this road felt different. The difference was not in the stones beneath his boots, not in the fields stretching toward distant horizons, not in the sky above him. The difference was within him. He walked more slowly. He noticed more. A small flower growing beside a fence. A bird carrying a twig toward a hidden nest. A farmer pausing in the middle of a field to watch clouds gather before continuing his work. Before entering the forest, he might have passed these moments without thought. Now they felt like small treasures. The world had always been full of stories. He had simply been too busy reaching the next destination to hear them. Days passed, then weeks. The traveler returned to familiar roads. Villages recognized him. People greeted him. Some asked where he had been. He answered honestly, "In a forest." They waited. That was usually the moment people expected something impressive. A tale of hidden gold, a forgotten castle, a mysterious creature, something dramatic enough to repeat beside a fire. Instead, he spoke of trees, of stones, of ordinary people whose kindness had survived longer than their names. Some listeners smiled politely, Some laughed. Some decided the forest air had clearly affected his thinking. And perhaps it had. But the traveler did not mind. Not every truth needed to convince everyone. Some things simply needed to be carried. He continued his old work, delivering messages between distant places. But he changed the way he traveled. When a village elder asked him to deliver a letter quickly, he still did so. When someone needed a message carried across a valley, he still accepted. But now he also noticed the people behind the messages. The tired farmer writing to his brother. The young woman sending words to a distant friend. The old craftsman asking for help from a former apprentice. Every letter represented a connection. Every message carried a piece of someone's life. And the traveler treated them differently. Not as objects, as memories waiting to happen. Years passed. The traveler grew older. His hair became silver. His steps became slower. His road became shorter. But he never forgot the forest. Occasionally, he returned. Not often. Not because he feared losing the path. Because he had learned something important. Some places should not be visited too frequently. Some wonders remain precious because they are allowed to rest. The forest always welcomed him. It never demanded explanations. It never asked where he had been. It simply remembered. On one of his final journeys, he carried the last of the seeds from the old wooden box. The box itself had become worn. The corners were smooth from years of handling. The seeds inside had traveled farther than many people ever would. He entered the forest once more. The trees seemed larger than he remembered. Or perhaps he was simply smaller than before. That happens with forests and mountains and memories. The things that once seemed enormous become even greater when we finally understand them. He followed familiar paths, past the streams, past the ancient stones, past the places where forgotten voices still rested quietly among the leaves. Eventually, he reached a clearing. There stood the young tree, the one he had seen long ago. It was no longer young. Its branches spread wide, its roots held firmly to the earth. Birds nested among its leaves. Small flowers grew around its base. The traveler smiled. "You did well." The tree moved gently in the breeze. Perhaps it answered. Perhaps it simply moved. Either way, he understood. He sat beneath its shade and rested. For a long while, he listened. The forest whispered around him. Not with sadness, not with farewell, with countless moments continuing. A child laughing, a traveler walking, a promise being made, a kindness being offered, a new beginning taking root. He finally understood the greatest secret of the forest. It did not remember everything because it feared losing the past. It remembered because every life was connected. Every person left something behind. Not always something grand, not always something visible, sometimes only a feeling, a lesson, a moment of kindness, a small choice that made another person's day lighter. Those were the things the forest protected. Those were the things that lasted. The traveler closed his eyes beneath the ancient branches. He thought about all the people whose names had vanished, the villagers, the craftsmen, the children, the wanderers, the countless souls who had passed beneath these trees. They had not disappeared completely. They remained in the quiet places, in the paths they walked, in the lives they touched, in the memories carried by the world around them. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the roots of the oldest trees, the forest was already remembering him too. Not because he had done anything extraordinary, not because he had discovered a secret, simply because he had walked gently, listened carefully, and cared enough to notice. The evening light settled across the clearing. The leaves moved softly overhead, and the forest that remembered everything continued listening as it always had, carrying every forgotten story into the endless years ahead. The traveler's journey was complete, but the forest's was not. Long after footsteps faded and voices became distant echoes, the ancient trees continued standing beneath the changing skies. Rain came, snow arrived, spring returned. The seasons moved like pages turning in a great and endless book, and beneath those branches, countless little moments continued to exist. A gentle hand helping another, a shared meal on a difficult evening, a quiet promise kept, a smile offered when one was needed most. These were the memories that never demanded attention. They did not appear in grand halls. They were not carved into monuments. They simply lived, softly, patiently, like seeds resting beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to grow. And perhaps that is the most comforting thing about the world. You do not need to become a legend to matter. You do not need your name carried across kingdoms. Sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the strongest root. Sometimes the quietest moment becomes the one that lasts. So wherever you are, whatever road you are walking, remember that every step becomes part of a story. Every choice leaves a trace. Every gentle action adds something to the world. The forest knew this. It had always known. And tonight, beneath the imagined shelter of ancient branches, you can rest knowing that forgotten things are not always lost. Somewhere, somehow, they continue. A memory, a feeling, a whisper carried softly through time. The leaves settle. The wind grows quiet. The forest listens, and the stories continue.